Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here today with a very special guest, Carla Davis, who is a genetic genealogist and is going to give us, I think, a lot of information about DNA, how to use it, how to find our family. So, welcome, Carla. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
No, so am I. So am I. So, let's start with what exactly is a genetic genealogist?
Well, a genetic genealogist is basically a genealogist who uses DNA science to merge with historical records to prove or refute family members.
Oh, so that's good. Yeah, and I think, a lot of us, we're confused about this whole, how to put together our DNA with our family trees on Ancestry or, one of the other places. Uh, and maybe you could explain to us about doing the DNA testing. I myself have done two. I've done Ancestry, of course, everybody does Ancestry. And
Yeah.
I also did living DNA. And I've sent my data off to probably three or four others. But as far as selecting a company to go with, should people look at that?
Well, if you're looking to test multiple branches of your family tree to identify those ancestors, you need to take an autosomal DNA test. Ancestry does autosomal, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage. They're all autosomal DNA testing companies. The one I recommend starting with is Ancestry DNA. It has the largest database, and you can upload that raw DNA data to other consumer databases like Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage for free. Now, 23andMe does not allow anyone to upload the raw DNA data, so you would have to take that test separately. But the idea is to get your DNA in as many ponds as possible to use it to the best of its abilities.
Yeah, and I did that. I uploaded it to, I think it was MyHeritage, and found a cousin that I never knew about, a second cousin that I never knew about, honestly. And we were trying to figure it out. And eventually she did Ancestry, like you said, which is a much bigger database. And we were able to make that connection. And but the interesting thing about that was my three cousins that I knew about, they all had done it.
Mhm.
And they had no idea about their half sister.
There are some surprises. You have to be prepared when you take a DNA test to accept what you know and perhaps what you don't know.
Yeah, and similar thing with a very good friend of mine. He did Ancestry, and he found out he had a half brother, older brother, that no one in the family apparently knew about. And the half brother grew up in Brooklyn, not far from where he grew up.
Amazing. Well, I
Yeah,
hope you had a great relationship after that.
yeah, actually they do. And it was the 50s and Italians, and I know a couple of people, similar stories where I think back then, if there was an Italian family who didn't have a child, they might just, say, well, so and so a few blocks away is looking for a child, and they would just hand off the child, you know?
That happened a lot. I mean, you can find babies in census records living with couples that are too old to be the parents. So that baby came from somewhere. A lot of
Yeah,
times it's a relative, or it could have been a neighbor.
yeah, and I think in that, and in his case, it was, like I said, probably just somebody that knew somebody, and they gave the child away, and I'm not even sure if back then they really had great records and the court approvals and all of that stuff going on.
That's right.
Um, so I did that, and I did living DNA. Oh, probably about 4 years ago now. And the reason I did living DNA was uh, I wasn't finding a lot of matches for my family in the United States,
Right.
and specifically my dad's family,
Mhm.
because not too many of them came. My grandfather came with his brother. The rest of the family stayed behind. My grandmother, as I learned, she was the only one from her family except for her aunt. So knowing that living DNA was based in Europe, I figured, well, I get a whole bunch of Italians, but people in Europe don't do as much testing as people in the United States.
Yet. I believe it's changing. I recommend MyHeritage for European ancestry. They seem to have, they've done the most DNA testing when it comes to Europeans. So are you on My Ancestry?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I'm on my heritage. Yeah.
Yes, good. Then did you have any luck there with your?
I found a few, but nobody really close. And we were supposed to be in Italy last April. We're hoping now we're going to be able to go in September. But I plan to bring, and somebody else said that they did this, so I'm going to bring some DNA test kits with me.
Yes.
And because I do know of third and fourth cousins, and through documentation we know we're related. But I'd like to have that DNA. I don't know why, but it's just nice to have.
Well, you need it because, we all inherit different parts of our DNA. So a third cousin might inherit something from your great grandparents that you did not inherit. And that DNA result will help you trace those ancestors.
Oh, really? Well, that's really interesting. That's really
Yes,
something.
it's good to have everyone in your family to test.
My dad had already passed away, but my mom, I kept thinking about it, and I never did it, and I wish I did. Um, and most of my aunts and uncles had passed on, so we don't have any of that data. But I do have a bunch of cousins. But what I found fascinating about living DNA also is that they map the maternal and paternal lines, which for anyone who hasn't done that, that's fascinating. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and what that means for your heritage.
Yes, so there's Y-DNA testing and mitochondrial DNA testing. A male, he can test his Y-DNA, which is the father's line for deep ancestry, or his mother's line, which is the mitochondrial DNA, and that's the mother's line for her deep ancestry. A female can only test for mitochondrial because she does not have any Y-DNA. So those tests are great for the males for finding a surname. If they're looking for their father's line, it can produce a surname, and it can help you test to determine deep ancestry. The mother's line is a little bit more difficult because with females, they marry and their last name changes. So you have a lot of different surnames on that mitochondrial DNA test, but you can still see where some of those lines have originated from. Like my mitochondrial DNA line originates from Austria. So I have a lot of Austrians within that, on those DNA testing matches, on those matches.
Yeah. And what was very interesting, well, two things. One is us Italians are lucky because the women do not change their name.
I love that.
Even today, so if you're researching Italian records in Italy, the woman's maiden name is always there, and they never change it, which was making me crazy when I was doing one part of the research because I couldn't find my grandmother, and then I realized, because I was looking at this noble line, and I realized, of course not, because she wasn't going to inherit anything, so they wouldn't even count her. But they do keep their names. What was really interesting about my mom, as far as we know, they're Italians, they're from Bari, and nobody left, nobody traveled more than 5 miles back then. And her line is like about 95% from the Caucasus, which kind of blew me away.
Yeah. And you were able to determine that through your mitochondrial DNA.
Yeah.
Love it.
And so when you get that result, you're kind of shocked, and maybe not surprising because my grandmother had blue eyes and was very fair skinned and all of that. And my dad's traces through, at least where people are now, through the northern part of Switzerland, which kind of makes sense. and a small little section of Spain. So it's really interesting when you do that. And then I don't know if you're familiar with My True Ancestry, but I shipped my DNA off to there. And what's really neat about them is they match your DNA, and I think it's more directional than anything else, but they match your DNA to archaeological digs, which is really interesting.
That's fascinating. I
Yeah,
did
so
not know that.
yeah, so if you haven't done that, check it out. My Ancestry, My True Ancestry,
My true
My
ancestry.
True Ancestry. Yeah.
Thank you. I definitely will.
And it's like I said, I think it's more, you're going back thousands of 10,000 years. I think it's more directional than anything else, but they have some way of doing that kind of stuff. So now, you do your tree on Ancestry, you get your DNA. How do you put those two things together to help you find more ancestors?
So what you need to do with every match, you need to look at your shared match list. When you look at your shared match list, you will find common ancestors among those matches that you can plug into your tree. And if they do not have a family tree, you need to build that tree out for them to find where they connect. So once you have identified, say you've tested a second cousin and you know this is your grandmother's line, well, he's going to be a shared match of that second cousin. Another good reason why all cousins, why so many different family members should test is because they might match one of your cousins but not match you. But it doesn't mean they're not from the same line and share the same common ancestor. It just means that you did not inherit that segment of DNA. So you look at those shared matches and you start putting those matches into your tree to build your genetic tree. And once you have a genetic tree built, you can start looking for the records to find other ancestors by looking at another cluster of your matches. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. And I never did that, and to be honest, I never really thought about it. So I look at my matches on DNA and I find, let's say, a fourth cousin, right? That I know is from the family is from Bari. So I have to put their parents, grandparents, and everybody in my tree.
Well, if you want to connect them in your family tree, then
Right.
yes. But say you have a great grandparent that you do not know who his parents were. Those genetic matches can help you figure that out. So you build out their tree, and either the historical records will reveal your line, or you might have to dig a little bit deeper and look. Maybe your relative moved to another area. You would have to maybe dig a little bit deeper in order to find where those lines connect. But those DNA matches are going to give you that clue that you need to connect those lines.
Oh, I have a lot of work to do.
DNA is just a clue. It's a clue. You can't do anything with it on its own. You have to match it with the historical records in order for it to work for you.
Yeah. So, and that's interesting because, and now it made it more clearer. For example, as you know, as we talked, my children are adopted, and when we did the DNA, I found out that my son is a fifth cousin of my wife's cousin.
Wow.
So now, but not of my wife. So to your point, it's very possible that they have the same relationship. Only that segment of DNA doesn't appear with my wife.
Exactly, because autosomal DNA will disappear over time. It's great for tracing up to 6 generations, but over time, that autosomal DNA is going to disappear. So that's why if you're looking to search 4, 5, 6 generations, definitely use autosomal DNA testing and get the oldest person in your family to test, because that every generation has valuable DNA that it's not going to hand down to the next generation.
Right. Okay. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And also, my friend that I spoke about before found his half brother. He called me one day, and right after he did the testing, and he said, "Hey, there's an MR in your tree." He said, "That's, I don't think that's you." He said, "But who is that?" And I said, "That's my wife." So he's a fifth cousin of my wife through Sicily, and my son is a cousin through Puerto Rico.
Oh, amazing. That's a great story.
So weird things happen. Like you said, you got to be prepared for some of this stuff.
Yes, you do.
And yeah, and eventually, so what happened is like I said, my daughter wanted to. She was 16. She wanted to find out who her birth parents were, and we told her, Florida state law, you can't do that. You have to wait till you're 18. Well, her birthday's January 1st, January 2nd. I'm 18. And in Florida, you can register. The parents can register and the children can register. Well, her birth parents hadn't registered. So we got a private investigator to help with the search. And I don't think it was that hard. I mean, he found them pretty quick. So they made the connection, and her birth mom, since she's done the DNA test and a couple others, so I have a pretty good clue on her. My son was never really that interested. I mean, we would ask him, Nicole, do you want to? And he's, no, and I think it was, I don't know, probably April or so of last year, his sister did the DNA and contacted me.
Okay.
So and
not know about.
Yeah, and so then I said to him, okay, well, we have a match on the DNA. Do you want to meet your birth family? And yeah, he said yeah. So with him, it was kind of like, and maybe that's just guys, he had to be right, or somebody had to find him to do the match. But he's since met his birth. He met his birth father. He hasn't met his birth mother yet, but they've been in contact and everything. But to your point, it's very interesting, because then you find out where you're from. And I think, I guess more and more adoptees are using DNA now to try and find out, because there may be no other avenue, especially if you're 40s, 50s, 60 years old.
Absolutely. More and more are using it to find the birth families, especially in states with closed records. When the records are sealed, they have no other means to find their birth families. And I knew who my maternal side was. I did not know who my father's side was. And once I had figured it out through DNA testing, I went to the courts to have my records unsealed, because now I have the names. I knew my mother's side. Everyone's deceased. And I asked them to open my records. I was told I could not have my records, that it was confidential information. I had to hire an attorney, spend about $1,200 to have my record unsealed. And a judge had to approve it, because I was in the state of Mississippi with the sealed record law. And it was just crazy to me to know that I had to go through so much red tape when everyone was known and no one was living to tell me that I could not have it.
Wow, that's just crazy. I mean, in this day and age, I mean, especially like you said, and and it's important for a lot of things. I mean, besides just, wanting to know where your roots are from and everything like that, it's important to know for, medical records and things like that these days.
Medical was the main reason. I mean, of course, I wanted to know who he was. Sadly, he had passed away. But my main reason for my search was medical history. I needed to know my medical history. And I cannot tell you how horrible it feels when I went to the doctor to fill out those forms, and I would always have to check unknown, because I did not know. So then they have to take all precautionary measures if I was to become ill, because they don't have the records to treat me properly based on my family history. I may
Right.
have to,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. No. So yeah, and I hadn't even thought of that. I thought about that before. Um, and the interesting thing about Nicole with her birth family, her they're from the South, like you are,
Oh, wow.
mostly from South Carolina,
Okay.
and she traces back to Daniel Boone, um, Captain Morgan, the pirate.
Oh, my goodness.
She's also a dispenser, Princess Di's family. Uh,
Yes.
and one of the funniest ones that I found because, well, two things. One is that her, I don't know if it was a grandmother or a great great grandmother, it was Italian, but going all the way back to King Henry VIII, I found out that she is a granddaughter of one of the Bassano brothers who were from Florence, who went to England as court musicians, and they played at the court of Henry VIII and stayed there. So she's got this Italian going all the way back to there, who stayed in England, and then you have this whole line of English, which is where her birth family, her birth father descends from. So it just gets crazy for us obsessed people. It's fun, but
Yes. She was amazed at all those discoveries.
yeah, no, absolutely. As was I. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think and I know we've talked a little bit about it. Is you get these roadblocks where you're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, don't give up, but sometimes you need to walk away for a little while
Yes.
and come back, and you may find the most interesting thing by accident sometimes, or I think it's karma sometimes. But how do you use DNA to tear down these brick walls or to find something that you're kind of stumped?
Okay, so I'll tell you the story about my great grandfather. There were rumors in our family that he had changed his name. Part of the family said he had changed his last name. Others said no, he had changed his entire name. So I said, you know what? I bet I can figure this out using the same methodologies I used to find my birth father. So I started thinking, okay, so if I'm looking for my great great grandparents, I need to look at my third cousin matches and fourth cousin matches. So I looked at those matches, looked at our shared matches that we had in common, and started building out those trees and putting those people in my genetic tree. And then I found census records for all of those children of the line that they were descending from. And there was one person who fit who he could be. And his name, his full name, was not the name of my great grandfather. I contacted several third cousin matches and I said, listen, this is what the rumors are in my family. Do you happen to know any stories about this one particular person that is in the family tree that most people on Ancestry have marked as deceased? And one of them wrote me back and she said that they don't know him to be deceased, but he had went to the South. He had gone down to the South and he had yellow fever and he was in quarantine, and then they never heard from him again. So they assumed he was deceased. Well, I had a picture of my great grandfather. She had a picture of her great great uncle. And when we put them together, it was the same exact person. So I started doing target DNA testing to test other members of the family to prove that which wife was his, which mother was his, in case there was another child that was not recorded on the census records. There were no other children, and it proved who his parents were. So I proved his parents through third cousin matches and targeted DNA testing.
Oh, okay. So when you say targeted DNA testing, when you found that person that you thought, might be a descendant of him. If they hadn't done DNA, you got them to do a DNA test.
Exactly. I kind of brought those lines forward. So I reverse engineer those lines. I have who they descend from, but now I need to find who those living people are so that I can contact them and ask them to help me out with my own goal. And most of them, I've only had one person ever tell me no. And it was just because she was not comfortable with the whole DNA scene, and she was older, and she was like, I'm just not comfortable. I'm sorry, I can't help you. But that was the only person that has ever told me no.
Wow, that's pretty neat. Yeah. Well, like I said, that's why I want to bring some test kits to Italy. Just for that alone. And I've used and I think you have too. What helped me a lot was Facebook, especially with my dad's family. My grandmother her last name was Piramalo. And that's not a very common name in Italy at all. In fact, it's really just that one family that has that name because they came from a nobility. So I couldn't find anybody in the United States. So I just went out on Facebook and I just started looking for every Piramalo I could find and started, saying this was my third great grandfather. This was my second great grandfather. Have you heard of these people? And they were coming back. Yes, we know who they are. This is, so I built out the tree partially through this lineage, but also through just contacting people on Facebook. And to your point, when we started sending pictures back and forth, it was really incredible to see the similarities between, some of the people in the family. Not everybody,
Right.
but some. So how would you suggest that people use Facebook or other social media to make these connections?
Well, I use Facebook all the time to do research. A lot of people, they'll post pictures of, family members that we might share in common, or maybe I'm working a case and I find people on Facebook and that they connect to these other people who are DNA matches, but I couldn't connect the two people together because neither one had trees. So it's incredible how much information you can find on Facebook. And I mean, I use Facebook as a research tool, but I also use Been Verified, which is it's a search for living records. So you can take the email address from the DNA match and you can plug it into Been Verified and do a reverse lookup. And it'll give you that person's information and you can kind of piece together their family tree.
Oh, okay. I never thought of using that. I've always been a little suspect of Been Verified, but and maybe a lot of other people are too, that, they're grabbing your information that you don't want them to have. But
well, they pull information from all types of different sources that are that's spread out over the web. They start pulling that information together so that one person that you're looking at, if it's a common name like John Smith, it might not be your John Smith. It might not be the John Smith that's matching, on that's that DNA that took that DNA test. It might be another John Smith. But if you take and you do a reverse lookup using that email address or whatever that you can find, say on Family Tree DNA, they have the email address. You can do a reverse lookup and it will pretty much identify that person. And you can find them on Facebook, contact them and say, you can ask them, are they the person that took the DNA test at Family Tree DNA, and tell them what you're researching and ask them if they'd like to share information. If they are interested, they'll say yes, and you guys could figure something out together about your family.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. So now you found out that your family was from the South. Have you been able to go far back in the United States? How far back do you go?
My roots are so deep in the United States. I'm in the early 1700s, and I have yet to get out of the United States. And every single line is like early 1700s. And I'm just there. I'm deeply rooted there on all paternal and maternal sides.
Yeah, no, that's the same thing with Nicole. Her birth father's family came, like the early 1600s, and so they've been here forever. And like I said, mostly in South Carolina, and um, they still have a significant, I would say, piece of property. I don't know, 60, 70 acres that, as far as I know, goes back generations and generations.
Oh,
Um, and yeah, it, they came in, if I remember correctly, they kind of worked their way south. They were in, like, Delaware and Maryland, and then into Virginia, and then eventually into South Carolina. So it's an interesting path, for sure. So now you have a website, I know, and you actually help people that are trying to find their birth parents, correct?
yes. I try to help. I mean, there are so many people that want to have these answers, and it is my mission to help as many people as possible to have those answers until these laws are changed to where every adoptee and every person can have their identity back. I mean, not everyone's going to want to be contacted. Maybe you are an adoptee and you're searching for your birth family, but that does not mean that they want to be found. But as adults, all parties can agree that it's not for them. They do not want to be contacted, and those wishes should be respected. But in the end, the adoptee deserves to know that information if they wish. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, you know, our kids are 25 and 23,
Mhm.
and by the time we went into that, in Florida, that was, I guess we were kind of a semi-open adoption. We didn't have direct contact with the birth parents, but we agreed to send them photos for the first 2 years, and we even went a little beyond that, I think. And like I said, Florida is one of the few states that actually have this registry,
Mhm.
that you can, make the connection if you want to make the connection. But I know it's very difficult for adopted children. I have a good friend. I guess Rose is she must be around 50-ish now, and she has no clue. And her parents are still alive. And when she asked her father, he's this, stern Italian guy, said, "You're my daughter. You don't need to worry about anything."
Right.
And so she doesn't even have a birth certificate.
Mhm.
And I said, "How'd you get a license?" And she goes, "I can't even tell you what I had to go through uh,
Mhm.
to get that." And I think for the children that are adopted, within the last 20, 25 years, it's not as difficult as somebody who's maybe in their 40s or 50s that, like I said, want to find out for medical reasons or other reasons. So if somebody hears this and does want to contact you on how to do this, how would they go about doing that?
They can go to my website, dnadavis.com, go to the contact tab, and send me a message, and I'll answer every email that I receive.
Well, that's just great. And, we'll be sure to get the word out there to people that are stumped on trying to find their birth parents. Because I think it's very, very important. I mean, we had told our children from the very beginning, ever since they could understand, that they were adopted. And, we did it for a couple of reasons, mainly because, we felt it was their right to know, but also, we didn't want them someday to be just surprised that somebody's, well-meaning or not well-meaning slips and it comes out, and then, they're confused when they're, 15, 16, 17 years old.
Well, I love that you did that for your children. I have mad respect for that.
There's not the stigma attached to whether you're the adoptive parent or the child that there once was. You go back to the Italian, where they call it the wheel. The churches had a little door with a rotating wheel in it, and you would put the baby in there and turn the wheel and walk away.
Okay.
A lot of times they were poor, they had too many children, whatever. They would leave the baby in the church, or in a convent. The crazy thing about it is, they would, a lot of times they would leave this is sad in a way. They would leave something on the baby, like a ribbon or metal
Mhm.
or something that years later they could go back and say, I left the baby with this. And the church
Yeah.
they would make a record of that. And that was the only way you could trace somebody.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, it's
Fascinating story.
yeah. And I had never known this, until I was researching, Italians, in the army prior to, World War I. So whether it was the revolution or, Custer's last stand, and I found there were 7 Italians at Custer's last stand. The only person who survived Custer's last stand was John Martin. His real name was Giovanni Martino. And he survived only because they sent him back to tell somebody else what was going on. And he was one of these babies that was left in the wheel and then
Yeah.
eventually came to America.
Wow.
Isn't that a crazy story?
That is crazy. I love that story though.
So
Are you a descendant of his?
no, I was just doing research, on just doing, backup Italian research for something, and then I came across him, and then I went more into detail. And when you watch the movies with John Wayne, you don't see the Italians in the army and fighting the Indians. So it was a fascinating story, and he was the only survivor, only because he wasn't there. Basically, they sent him back to tell somebody else what was going on.
Wow, great story. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I'll send you the link to it so you could read it. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we got a lot of good hints and clues for people, whether they want to understand what DNA is all about, how to put that DNA together with their online family tree, or for someone who's adopted and is lost about how to go about finding their birth family.
Thank you.